I'd like to start off by thanking Ryan O'Connell for his patience and allowing us to delay the conversation a little bit to allow that previous conversation to unfold a little bit more. Ryan is obviously joining us from Zoom. Ryan currently works for Trinity Health Corporation and is presenting on Everything is Connected, reading Yuuyaraq and Laudato Si in a time of ecological crisis. And Ryan, I'll trust you to correct my pronunciation.
Okay. All right. So, good morning, folks. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I wish I could be with you all in person, but still virtually. I'm very, very happy to be a part of this. And first, I want to extend a note of gratitude to Marquette University, and again to all of you, and for Ben, who welcomed me to give this presentation as part of this colloquium. I also want to extend my gratitude to the Yupik people and Yupik elders whose voices bring such wisdom to their own communities and whose words I ventured to use as part of my presentation. Please note that I use these voices with the utmost sincerity of heart and only with a desire to affirm the resilience of Yupik culture, the goodness of the Yupik people, and with the hope that indigenous peoples like the Yupik will become principal dialogue partners with church and civic leaders in developing pathways toward an implied integral ecology that will heal the ongoing degradation of the natural and social environments we all inhabit. So, why this topic? Why attempt to bring indigenous wisdom traditions into greater dialogue with Laudato Si, a document produced by the leader of an institution with an extremely complicated history of involvement with indigenous peoples? For a few reasons, really. For one, there's an ongoing need for reconciliation between the West and especially between institutional Christianity and indigenous peoples. And there can be no reconciliation where there is no appetite to understand the history, values, and traditions of another people or culture. I also believe that indigenous peoples have a great deal to teach the West, especially toward developing an authentic ecological consciousness and an understanding that human beings exist within a sacred universe and that the divine act of creation is ongoing and calls us to respond to and participate in it. The quotes here are taken from Laudato Si and highlight Francis's recognition that not only is it necessary at this stage of human development to involve all perspectives in order to navigate the ecological challenges we face as a planetary community, but also that indigenous peoples ought to be treated by the West as principal dialogue partners. This presentation puts Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si in conversation with Yuuyaraq, the indigenous tradition of the Yupik people of southwestern Alaska. I hope that by the end of this presentation, the reason for Francis's preferential option for the indigenous will become more apparent. As our planetary community continues to struggle with this global ecological crisis, when we consider what theology and the West can hope to learn from greater dialogue with indigenous peoples, let us remember that the Yupik, like indigenous communities across the world, have experienced the disastrous effects of rapidification, the technocratic paradigm, and the throwaway culture for centuries, and yet they survive. So before I proceed, I just want to give a little context on the Yupik homeland. The Yupik have lived in the Yukon-Kuskokwim or YK Delta of Alaska for nearly 3,000 years. As you can see from the picture on the right, it is a spectacularly beautiful place, almost otherworldly. But what you may not be able to necessarily pick up from these images is that the Yupik homeland is massive, about 75,000 square miles, consisting of the tundra landscape of interior Alaska, the Bering Sea coast, and several islands along the coast. As of 2021, there are over 23,000 Yupik people living in the YK Delta in 58 villages consisting of between 25 and 1,000 individuals, or in the city of Bethel, which is home to nearly 7,000 people. Yupik elder Mark John was quoted as saying, "Yuuyaraq describes everything in our Yupik way of being. It is a tradition that has been passed down through the stories, teachings, dances, and spiritual practices of the Yupik people over many generations, and encompasses the language, beliefs, moral education, and ethical behavior by which Yupik people have maintained their communal and cultural identity for thousands of years. And it's essential to understand that Yuuyaraq is inextricably connected to this place." So can Yuuyaraq be considered a theological frame? Well, that's a complicated question. But I believe the answer is yes, insofar as it's concerned with three fundamental relationships that guide the human experience: human beings and the divine, human beings and one another, and human beings in the natural environment in which we live. As I alluded to on the previous slide, Yuuyaraq is place-based and it's tribal, meaning it's primarily concerned with a particular people and a particular place. It also reflects what is often understood as an animistic belief system that views all things as possessing a soul or spirit, including plants, rocks, weather phenomena, etc. And yet, as the quote at the top of this slide from Yupik writer Harold Napoleon states, to Yupik, the land, rivers, heavens, and seas, and all that dwell within them are spirit. Not that these aspects of creation possess spirit, but they are spirit. And this reflects the reality that from a traditional Yupik perspective, there is no boundary between the material and the spiritual. All is intertwined. Everything is connected, and this sort of consciousness necessitates a certain way of living that respects the sacred nature of all things, while allowing the people the means to survive both the animals and lands on which they live. In other words, the Yupik are concerned with maintaining a balance or harmony between all forms of life. And so over thousands of years that the Yupik have lived in the YK Delta, they have developed a complex tradition of rituals and ceremonies intended to sustain this balance, primarily through the subsistence lifestyle that the Yupik continue to practice today. Fishing, hunting, berry picking, etc. The subsistence lifestyle is governed by an ethic rooted in restraint and reciprocity. Yupik anthropologist Oscar Quagley cites Canadian anthropologist Milton M.R. Freeman and ecologist Ludwig Carden, who note that traditionally, the Yupik possessed appropriate ecological knowledge and suitable methods and technology to exploit resources, but they also possessed a philosophy and environmental ethic to keep exploitative abilities in check. And they established ground rules for relationships between humans and animals. And to be clear, the subsistence lifestyle is more than just an ecologically sound way of living. It actually has been compared to a religious practice in the Yupik community. And this is because the subsistence lifestyle incorporates the people's shared beliefs in the key concepts I've listed here. First, there is Ella. And Ella can be thought of as a sort of foundation of the spirituality of the Yupik people. It's a concept that has been likened to an ecosystem, but pertains to far more than material interconnectedness. Yupik elder Paul Tunchuk was recorded by University of Alaska anthropologist Anne Feinert-Gordon, describing Ella as more of a paradigm within which everything exists, and how, quote, everything inside Ella has customary teachings and instructions attached to it. Ella Mua is the person of the universe, and is understood as the author or animating force of Ella. Historically, people communicated with Ella Mua both through formal religious ceremonies facilitated by Angalkas, or shamans, as well as in day-to-day life in the river, ocean, or tundra while fishing, hunting, berry picking, etc. Although there are some distinctions, and some of them are significant, between the Western conceptualization of God and Ella Mua, this concept is one that early Christian missionaries attempted to explain as the people's naturally derived awareness of God, or even in some cases the prefiguration of Christ. Yuuyaraq is best explained perhaps through an anecdote. Yupik writer Harold Napoleon describes how when an animal allows itself to be hunted by a human, its spirit, or Yuuyaraq, departs its physical body and will enter a different animal. If the Yuuyaraq had been previously treated with respect when it was in the body of its former animal, it will allow itself to be hunted again. If it was not respected by the hunter, it would be less inclined to allow itself to be hunted in the future. Therefore, in Yuuyaraq, great attention is given to explaining certain ways of caring for non-human life, alive or dead, to maintain this cycle and protect the community's access to food. Yuuyaraq describes the big shared belief in the responsiveness of the world to the action of human beings, and reflects the conceptualization that the natural world is not just the object or victim of human activity or inactivity, but another moral subject that possesses its own will and agency as an entity to whom the people can relate. This is made better explained on the next slide. So from a traditional Yupik perspective, the natural world, like I said, is a knowing and responsive place, possessing both agency and will. For instance, if the weather quickly changes from calm to stormy, it could reflect a person or community's apathy toward Yuuyaraq, the personhood of the natural environment. And the storm could be the spirit consciousness of the universe, Ella, holding humanity accountable for our mistakes. Yupik elder John Philp was recorded by Feinert-Gordon describing the sudden onset of a storm by saying the weather is hunting for those who don't listen. Similarly, Elder David Martin described the personhood of the ocean, which not only knows about human transgressions, but reacts to them with anger and disgust. Quote, the ocean gets mad and becomes angry just like a person. When those who do not follow the belief in Yahweh are upset, the ocean boils up in anger and the wind howls, end quote. These words reflect the views of a people who exist within a universe where human action always elicits reactions from human and non-human creatures alike. A world where acts of compassion will result in feelings of gratitude and good fortune, whereas acts of willful ignorance and failure to follow the rules will result in hurt feelings and failure to catch animals. Indeed, according to Yuuyaraq, the health of the relationships between the personhoods of animals, our humans and non-human animals, plants, and the universe itself are interrelated. And in contrast to the more tribal and place-based focus of Yuuyaraq, Francis articulates a more cosmic framework for how humans can relate to creation in Laudato Si. Throughout this document, he expresses a Christian perspective that everything in the universe exists as the expression of a loving creator, that all life is united by a dynamic of love between the loving creator and the beloved creation. And by means of greater contemplation and the development of an ecological spirituality grounded in the Christian faith, humankind may come to a full realization that everything is connected, and to exist means to exist in relationship. And so what is the nature of this relationship between all forms of life? We as creation are a family. And this is significant because it frames Francis's reflection on the degradation of the natural and social environments. Unlike proponents of the throwaway culture that see the natural and social environments as exploitable and over which human beings can justifiably employ a dominion or a dynamic of domination, Francis calls for a conversion to the dynamic of love, the way of the Creator, which of course is appropriate if we view human and non-human aspects of creation as members of one's family. But I want to draw attention to this last quote here from Francis, because this is important in considering Laudato Si in dialogue with indigenous perspectives. Not only is he, of course, alluding to the developments in the natural sciences over the last century, biology, physics, etc., but he's also stating that there is a level of mystery involved in all of the members of our cosmic family relate to one another, and that human beings will never fully explore or understand this. And so why is the idea of the mystery of our interrelatedness significant? Well, it's important to remember that since the time of first contact between indigenous peoples in the West, the spirituality that informed the ritual and practice of various tribes and peoples, including the Yupik, their belief in the kinship of all creatures, and the reciprocity that informs relationships between humans and non-humans, was determined by missionaries and representatives of institutional Christianity to be wrong, childish, savage, even satanic. And yet the Pope is now articulating that, you know what? We don't exactly know the full scope or depth of these relationships. And so as the emerging ecological consciousness within theology continues to develop, questions regarding how different aspects of creation relate to or can communicate with one another remain relevant. In particular, revisiting traditional notions of consciousness and hierarchies of being are some of the areas contemporary theologians might more deeply explore in collaboration with indigenous voices. Yuuyaraq and Laudato Si both offer answers to questions on the nature of the human person and how human beings ought to relate to our surroundings. Many Yupik elders recognize the current symptoms of ecological crisis in their communities as a consequence of the people forgetting who they are. They lament that the transmission of Yuuyaraq is more fractured than in the past, and so children are not growing up with a strong sense of how to relate and interact with their environment. Many growing up in the YK Delta today no longer possess an ethic grounded in restraint and reciprocity, and as a result, there is disharmony between human and non-human life. For proponents of Yuuyaraq, it is not that Allah has changed, it is that human beings have changed. And so the so-called natural environment continues to respond to human behavior as it always has, but the balanced relationship between human and non-human life that was achieved through the transmission of Yuuyaraq is no longer present. As a result of the ongoing disharmony between human and non-human life, there is great suffering among the people and a significant loss of biodiversity in the YK Delta. In Laudato Si, Francis also recognizes that disharmony is at the root of the ecological crisis. Original sin, marked by humanity's desire to displace the authority and power of the Creator, has grown into a tyrannical anthropocentrism that only grows more destructive due to the pressure and confusion resulting from ongoing repetification, the throwaway culture, and the technocratic paradigm. These forces homogenize the diverse cultures of the planetary community into a single consumer culture that commodifies everything, including the human person. In response to this destructive homogenization, Francis calls for a conversion to heal the ruptures caused by original sin and restore the original harmony within the vital relationships of the human experience, human beings and God, human beings with our neighbor, and human beings with the earth itself. As we will look at next, both Yuuyaraq and Laudato Si attempt to provide pathways via moral education to help their audiences return to a way of being that will promote ecological balance. And so for proponents of Yuuyaraq, it's quite clear how people can work to remember themselves and essentially reintegrate themselves back into harmony with their surroundings. It is by adhering to the building blocks of the indigenous Yupik moral education system, which are the Kanayotet and the Inerkotet, the rules for the right way of living, and admonishments for what sort of behavior to stay away from. These include admonishments against things like shooting an animal or pure enjoyment with no intention or respect for the life of that animal. But the moral education goes much deeper than that. Kanayotet encompasses wisdom that touches every aspect of life, from behavior between children and adults, between men and women, to how to make and utilize tools, how to keep communal spaces clean, what time to wake up, etc. Yupik elder Frank Andrew, when describing an era when Yuuyaraq was thoroughly followed in Yupik communities, was noted as saying, quote, "There were an architect for everything we did. If something has an admonition attached to it, we were told it's best to stay away from it, even though it appears to be trivial and fun," end quote. These instructions and admonishments were eminently practical and have been described by Andrew as akin to a walking stick, in that, quote, "A person who merely hears the teachings and does not live by them is only holding them and has no idea how to use them properly on their path," end quote. Furthermore, the transmission of Yuuyaraq is believed to be the ultimate sign of intergenerational love. Yupik elder Paul John was recorded as saying, quote, "After giving us young people instruction on living proper lives, our elders always told us, 'We talk to you because we love you. If we did not love you, we would not speak to you,'" end quote. And so passing down of moral education engendered trust across life stages. And it was this trust that guaranteed community cohesion and instilled communal resilience against social or environmental challenges. In Laudato Si, Francis espouses a kind of moral education that hinges upon a distinction between ecological education and ecological conversion. He believes that ecological education alone will be insufficient to address the symptoms of ecological crisis. He does not discount the importance of the pursuit of a more ecologically engaged citizenry, but he believes the actions that can be taken by government or what can be taught in schools are unlikely to dismantle the, quote, "paradigm of consumerism," end quote, unless a deeper renewal or ecological conversion takes place. This conversion will happen via the adoption of a more contemplative lifestyle, a different attitude toward life and others marked by universal solidarity, and a re-engagement with Christian spirituality where, quote, "the life of the spirit is not disassociated from the body or from nature or from worldly realities, but lived in and with them, in communion with all that surrounds us," end quote. Francis offers the role model of St. Francis of Assisi as the example of one who experienced the moral coherence to be gained through ecological conversion. Of him, the Pope writes, "His concern for the poor, his familiar relationship with the natural world, and his experience of the inner peace that is only possible when one lives in right relationship with God, with the divine, were all aspects of the saint's integrated relationships with earth, neighbor, and God." St. Francis's ecological conversion put him in touch with the cosmic family, such that he was able to view all creatures, no matter how small, as his brothers and sisters, living under the authority of a loving God. So what do these frameworks that we've been exploring call humanity toward, assuming the human community is able to reintegrate ourselves into a way of being and living where everything is connected? It's unclear to me, based on my conversations with Yupik elders and research, whether or not Yuuyaraq involves a teleological or eschatological vision for the destiny of humankind or the Yupik people in particular. Instead, those working to restore Yuuyaraq in the Yupik homeland focus on restoring the balance between human and non-human life, with the hope that this will heal the suffering of human and non-human life. There's an ongoing movement in YK Delta to restore Yuuyaraq via the restoration of the Yupik language, while creating opportunities to bring elders into greater contact with young people, to teach them the ways and wisdom of their ancestors, so they will know what it means to be Yupik, to be a human being. The goal of this movement is to bring forth a new generation of Yupik people who don't feel alienated from their homeland and from a belief system that allowed their people to flourish for thousands of years. By recovering an ethic of restraint and reciprocity that once defined the Yupik way of being, the people will experience a regeneration. The biodiversity and the health of the natural environment will regenerate. And more importantly, the tragic deterioration in the social environment, which is manifest through extraordinarily high rates of suicide, especially in young people, domestic and sexual violence, substance abuse, all symptoms of the complex intergenerational trauma experienced in the homeland, will be healed. In Laudato Si, the teleological and eschatological significance of ecological conversion is more explicit. Pope Francis does more than simply elevate one's relationship with the earth as another approach to God and divine plan for all creation. He articulates the notion that one's relationship with the earth, one's neighbor, and God must be fully integrated in order to understand God's plan for creation. Otherwise, not only will the fullness of the relationship between humanity and the divine remain obscure, but also that the ongoing degradation in the natural and social environments caused by human activity is unlikely to change. Laudato Si illuminates the breadth of disharmony that currently guides the human experience, but it is also an ethical and spiritual itinerary for how human beings can return to a more harmonious state with the earth, one's neighbors, and God. Integral ecology illuminates another dimension of God's invitation to creation. God not only invites human beings into relationship with himself, but with all of creation toward the fulfillment of the ultimate destiny of all beings. For Francis, once this invitation is accepted via ecological conversion, humans can begin to heal the damage we have caused to the natural and social environments. Once this process of healing begins, the human experience will be more like a, quote, wonderful pilgrimage, where everything is related, and all humans, all brothers and sisters, woven together by the love God has for each of his creatures, and united in fond affection with brother sun, sister moon, brother river, and mother earth. And so, in conclusion, Pope Francis has called for a new dialogue for how human beings are shaping life on this planet, and the need for a conversation that includes everyone. As contemporary voices in theology work to retire or expand traditional conceptualizations of God, creation, the human experience, important questions are emerging regarding the nature of the relationships between members of the cosmic family of creation. And so the challenge and opportunity faced by theology is this: whose voices need to be heard when confronting these questions? How can theology treat indigenous peoples as principal dialogue partners when confronting these questions? As this conversation continues, indigenous peoples such as the Yupik can provide valuable insight and wisdom that they have developed over thousands of years. By bringing indigenous worldviews like the Yuuyaraq into closer dialogue with theology, it will be possible to construct a more democratic vision of integral ecology that values the fullest diversity of human experience. In doing so, theology can continue to guide humanity in three important areas. Number one, theology can continue to advocate for voices on the margins of our planetary community and decolonize theological concepts regarding God, creation, sin, and challenge other disciplines traditionally concerned with things like sustainability and ecology or indigenous studies to do the same. Number two, theology can continue to be a force of reconciliation between indigenous peoples, institutional Christianity, and the West, while amplifying voices of Christian and non-Christian indigenous perspectives from around the world. And number three, theology can continue to develop a vision of an applied integral ecology that can assist the human community toward a deeper understanding of the reality that everything, human and non-human, material and spiritual, immediate and cosmic, is indeed connected. Thanks for having me, everybody.
Open the floor to questions. Pat Byrne, and I'm going to ask you, Pat, can you start talking and then I can check and see if he can hear you?
Okay, can you hear me, Ryan?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I don't really so much have a question as sort of an observation that's kind of a revelation in a way. In a way, I think I would say at this point, having heard you and several others, that Laudato Si is not exactly something new. It's sort of retrieving something that's been part of human cultures, arguably for millennia, if not longer. And I'm really impressed with the way that you have thought out the connections and the parallels here. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Jim?
Thank you so much, Ryan. This is Jim.
Hey, Jim.
I just have a practical question, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your future intentions with this work, maybe some of the programs that you're looking at applying to in the fall. And then, I don't know, if any of us have ideas for places where a project like this might land, I think that could be a helpful thing to keep in mind, and we could offer that advice to Ryan. So.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it was mentioned at the beginning that I work for Trinity Health, which is a health system that's national. I live in upstate New York, and I'm a clinical social worker. And I was a Jesuit volunteer in Bethel in 2011, and then I was a teacher for a while in high schools and bring students back out to the Yuuyaraq homeland. And that's sort of where these ideas really started to kind of take shape. And there's a movement right now, like I was saying, to recover the indigenous way of being and knowing and living in the Yuuyaraq homeland. That's actually being run through the health system out there, the Ecological Health Corporation. And so people in Bethel and the surrounding communities have created, it's called Ecological, which is a cultural model of care. And so it's a way of pursuing healing, especially when it comes to those kind of behavioral health trends I spoke briefly about, suicide and substance abuse, those kinds of things, from a cultural mindset and a mindset of renewal and a renewal of sense of personal and communal identity. And so that was something that really kind of struck me as someone who works in behavioral health. As to, looking at these parallels between spirituality, behavioral health, cultural identity, and certainly theology. And like was said by Pat, I think there is this sort of renewal of this sense of what can be sort of rediscovered about oneself, about one's culture, spirituality, etc., and how that can be pursued toward healing the damage that human beings have been causing for quite a while. And so, in terms of the future, I would love to pursue these ideas in a doctoral program. And I have looked into programs in the Northeast where I live, Boston College and Fordham University, where I did my undergrad work, certainly Notre Dame, Yale. These are programs I've looked at. I'm certain that there are other programs, potentially out west, that might be more intrigued by, doing work, especially between, people such as the Yupik. But I do think that there's hopefully some interest and appetite to pursue these kinds of questions and relationships between indigenous and Western Christian, theological ideas. So we'll see. But if anybody has any suggestions of who to reach out to or where to reach out for 2026, I would love to talk more about that.
We have three more hands, if that's okay. Is anybody responding directly to that question, or are these new statements? Yeah, maybe Ryan, I could share your email out in case anybody.
Sure.
You can always apply here.
Cody says you can always apply at Marquette. Cody is, of course, the director of admissions here, so he. Okay, so I'll take Joseph first.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to let you know that your paper resonated with me because I am from Africa, and that is exactly the way we see things in the point of view of all is sacred. The interconnectedness of reality, the central point is integration. So when you are, I have always personally struggled when I have to deal with different cultural, intellectual framework that is dualistic. And you see that facing you all the time, but the way to resolve that is something that is, for me, I see within Western education and Western tradition that even though everything appears to be dualistic, at the end of the day, humanity as a whole is always either looking out for integration or in the final analysis is all integrated. So this would now bring me to a question I wanted to ask. Maybe not you, but from Reed's presentation, which I agree with Reed. What you struggle with in Lonergan is what I struggle with when reading Lonergan. Even though you may think that it is related only to First Nations people, everybody who is non-Western reading Lonergan confronts and actually struggles with that. It's not only Lonergan. When Karl Jaspers goes on axial age, I am excluded completely, and I say people from other parts of the world, this is a different way of narrating history. So the problem therefore is, if all is sacred, what do we think of differentiated and undifferentiated consciousness? If ecology, if Francis is talking about integral ecology, what does that say about Lonergan's differentiation of consciousness? Not only Lonergan, but centrally Western phenomenology, whether it is existential or psychological, when there is the emphasis on differentiation of consciousness, where does that leave us?
Okay, I would like to take the last three questions, but maybe we could, we're 15 minutes past time, maybe we could make them kind of abbreviated if possible. So I've got Reed and Henry and Richard.
I mean, mine sort of follows from what Joseph said, which is to say that, Ryan, I was going to ask you, so you at the beginning you sort of built a bit of a contrast between Francis and the elders that you're talking to. And so my question is very simple. Like, to concretize the difference between the kind of localization and the kind of cosmic vision. Well, how would Laudato Si be different if you consulted with the elders that you talked to? Right. Like, what would he have changed if he had a deeper immersion in the conversations that you had? That's all. Yeah. And then you wanted to get all the questions first, right? Or I don't know.
Go ahead. I think three may be overwhelming. Go ahead. If you like, Ryan.
Okay. That is a great question. That is such a great question, and my feeling is that it would be a much longer document than it is.
Probably not right.
And he might be able to reorient the way people think about daily living and be more kind of practical in the way that one can pursue this ecological conversion. There tends to be, it gets a little bit kind of abstract or just kind of speculative almost when Francis is discussing how to go about kind of reorienting yourself to creation. And from these people you might speak with who have a different, way of understanding what it means to be in a relationship with, these integrated relationships, where everything is sacred and connected. The advice tends to be very practical, and so, he might spend more time thinking about how one wakes up in the morning. What does one do after opening their eyes? What does one do in terms of, a prayer life that is not kind of situated to be in a particular place or a particular time? How is prayer something that you pursue in your day-to-day living? How can turning the key to your car be a prayer of some kind? Those kinds of ways of understanding the way of living as a prayer, which is not necessarily something that Christianity has never touched, right? But I think you might have more of a lean into this mystical way of understanding everything. That you both are holding this mystery and this, ability for humanity to interact with this mystery kind of together as the real dynamic of what living is all about, if that makes sense. Yeah, does that maybe start to get to the answer? That's a great question.
Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, given the conversations that we've been having this weekend, that Marquette might be a good program choice, especially with respect to some of the questions that you're asking, Ryan, and a potential to connect with, I don't know if you were on earlier for the Indigeneity Lab, and questions that Lonergan folks here seem to be asking. So that was just a suggestion.
Thank you, Ryan. Richard Miller here. Thank you so much for that. Just quickly, this is such a rich vision that animates the Yupik people. This is probably too big a question, but just to give me a sense of how it's being appropriated to help with the historical trauma that's with your own social work in terms of, we've talked about ecology, but the social element with regards to mental health and alcoholism and how this tradition's being appropriated to deal with those. And yeah, go ahead.
That's an awesome question, and I'm so glad you brought that up. So there's a woman named Rosemary Dominic who I met during my time as a Jesuit volunteer, and it's sort of following her kind of career path. Since, and she is involved in behavioral health. I'm not exactly sure if she's a social worker, but she's certainly a key stakeholder in this conversation of how to connect, with this indigenous, way of understanding your relationship with other people, the natural world, yourself. She has been integral in developing this program that is a culture-based model of care. So she went to the health corporation, and she works for this health corporation. And she said, when you look at what's going on in the hospital, you look at these rates of incarceration, you look at the lack of success that Western models of behavioral health care are having with the people who live here, it's time to probably think of something else. And so the rationale was people are having this crisis of identity because of the legacy of boarding schools, because of the external pressures from media, from the Western education system, etc., that they are unable to really, they're forgetting essentially who they are and how they relate to this place where they have lived and where their people have lived for thousands of years. And that is causing a kind of existential crisis of sorts that is really being lived out generation after generation, at least for the last 150, 200 years, in terms of traumatic responses to just being a student in your high school or having, kind of typical relationship challenges, as a teenager, would have. And so Rosemary's thought process was we have to try to give them a greater sense of who they are, which means rediscovering this language. And the language piece is really, integral. It's essential to understanding the concepts we were talking about before, Ella and Rook, and all of these things are connected with, the practical applications of hunting and fishing. These are seen as kind of restorative, approaches to healing. Fishing is something that is it feels essential to who a person is in that community. And so, finding opportunities to tap into that, to kind of have this, these experiences where you feel this sense of restoration instead of this sense of consistent fracturing, if that makes sense. That is the way they're approaching healing. So they bring elders into contact with young people, and the elders, they're allowed or they're encouraged to share stories, to share this kameotet, this wisdom that they have learned, from their fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers, etc. And it's having a lot of success. That's not to say that there aren't very significant challenges in that area still, but it's a way where the community takes ownership of the care of their young people. And instead of relying on a system that was developed outside the Yupik homeland and is very much staffed by people from outside the Yupik homeland, they are now kind of building this grassroots approach to helping heal people who have been, traumatized in many different ways over the course of 100 or 200 years. Does that help answer? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's very, very rich. We could talk for hours about that, but I really appreciate it. Thank you.
If we'd all join me in thanking Ryan for this wonderful experience. Ryan, thank you very much. And I'll share your email address out with anybody who might have additional recommendations for you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to continue this conversation. Thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan.